This week, of course, the world is marking the 75th anniversary of D-Day, the beginning of the end of World War II. On June 6, 1944, 150,000 British, American and Canadian troops stormed the beaches of Normandy. It was a dramatic bid to free France from the Nazis with the biggest combined land, air and naval operation in history. Well, tonight we're going to take a closer look at the strategy and intricate preparation it took to hold the Normandy invasion, but also the effect it had on the thousands who took part. Joining me for tonight's debate, we have with us still on the set, historian and author Jacob Field. Jacob, thanks again for being with us. Also, Julie Legac. Julie, hello. You're a historian, an author, and a professor. We also have with us live from London Anne Seba, who is an author of the book Les Parisiennes. Welcome, Anne. Thank you for being with us. And from the U.S., from Newport, Rhode Island, naval historian Craig Simmons. Thank you, Craig. Welcome to all four of you. Just before we begin our debate, let's take a look at the events of D-Day as they unfolded on June 6, 1944. Here's Valerie de Kemp.
Wherever I looked, there were boats, stretching from the coast to the horizon. This is how a British soldier described landing on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. The mastermind behind the operation, Dwight D. Eisenhower. The American general had 150,000 soldiers and 7,000 ships under his command. All had a clear mission. With the entire coast occupied by German soldiers, the first objective of Operation Overlord was to secure a landing zone to allow some 4 million troops to safely cross the channel. Allied troops first pretended to land in Calais, a decoy to draw the Germans' attention away from their real objectives. American soldiers were to land on beaches codenamed Utah and Omaha, the British on Gold and Sword, and the Canadians on Juno. At midnight, paratroopers were deployed behind enemy lines, another diversion to cause more confusion in the Nazi ranks. 6 hours later, the first American troops landed on Utah. At Omaha Beach, the landing backfired. German troops were waiting with heavy artillery and opened fire on the Americans, inflicting heavy losses. On Gold, the landing was a success, while on Juno, rough waters and unexpectedly heavy resistance by German troops inflicted more casualties. On Sword Beach, British soldiers managed to land, but their advance towards the city of Caen was halted by a German counterattack. Widely regarded as the offensive that changed the tide of the war, Operation Overlord was supposed to be over in 3 weeks, but ended up lasting 3 months.
All right, let's start with Craig Simmons joining us from Newport, Rhode Island. Craig, one of the things that we often don't mention when we talk about D-Day is what could have gone wrong. We talk a lot about what went right. But one thing in particular that's quite interesting here is the role of the weather. Tell us about that.
Well, actually, there are a number of things that went wrong. It's 75 years later, looking back, when we know the final outcome, that it seems that, well, of course, things worked just the way they were supposed to. That certainly was not the case, and the weather was a critical part of that. That window, that very narrow window of opportunity that was forecasted by the British major, who was the chief meteorologist, James Stagg, telling Eisenhower, yes, the wind is blowing outside and it looks like almost hurricane conditions, but it's going to get better tomorrow. It won't be perfect, but it might just be good enough. And of course, it was on Eisenhower's shoulders to make the final decision about what he would do with that information. And he's the one who decided, okay, we'll go.
Jacob, tell us a bit more about then after they said, let's go. What happened next?
Well, they set the huge armada in motion. So they gathered in the channel at a place which was called Piccadilly Circus. And then the men went on their 17-hour, in some cases, sea voyage across the beaches to Normandy. It was very rough weather. The American troops were wearing thick new woolen uniforms which had been embedded with chemicals because they thought they were going to be chemical warfare. So apparently it made them extremely nauseous. So it was a really rough crossing and took a very long time. And while that was happening, you have the aerial operations going on, and scores of gliders and paratroopers landing on the flanks of the beaches.
And Seb, I'd like to bring you in as well from London. Now, you told me that your father and your father-in-law were both veterans. They both fought in Normandy. What stories did they tell you that remain with you today?
I think that's the really interesting thing, the way the narrative in England is so different, because this was an existential battle. And I grew up, I'm a baby boomer. I was born in 1951. So, you know, my father went over in a tank on D+1. I hope you can see I'm wearing a Fear Naught badge from the Royal Tank Brigade. That was something that he gave to my mother. So it was a very precious, I mean, intrinsically, it has no value at all. But these stories were terribly important because some of the tanks didn't even make it, some of the young soldiers, and some of them were really young, didn't even survive getting off the boats in these churned up waters, carrying heavy packs. So it was a horrific thing to go through, and then to fight in the Battle of Caen. He fought in the Battle of Caen. He couldn't even talk about that because it was so savage and so bloody. And how on earth can you prepare for it? My father-in-law went over on D-1, so that's the day before. He went in one of the gliders, and I've actually brought you a glider wheel, his glider wheel, that was so important, because I think that shows you why these narratives were so important for me growing up. So capturing Pegasus Bridge, that was actually the first Allied operation, and my father-in-law in his 20s was towed in a glider and was one of those from the Ox and Bucks who was responsible for capturing this road bridge, which was critical for the British forces to get across and make their way into Caen. And he too fought in the Battle of Caen. I mean, my father and father-in-law didn't know each other, but, you know, this is typical of that generation, that they had this event that cemented their friendship, and he too was unable to talk about the Battle of Caen. It was just so desperate. Of course, they both survived, but I suppose what I'm saying is how these stories informed my growing up, that this was a golden generation, people who were terribly young, incredibly courageous, and they fought these battles for the free world that we grew up in. So, you know, how could I not be a child when I became a historian wanting to know more about these things that informed our family lives?
Julie, we just heard Anne there speaking about the bravery of these young men. And yet we can all put ourselves in their shoes. We can all imagine how difficult it might have been. What did the soldiers do to conquer their fear? Was it just the group movement that led them to go on?
Of course, the solidarity with their comrades helps them to stand in front of this massive war violence. But I also think, or that's what the veterans say, or the testimonies say, that they tried not to think too much and just they had a survivor instinct, and they just tried to continue, go on, move on, and just survive until the next day.
Craig, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, the thing that always fascinates me is how these young men were able to dehumanize the enemy, so to speak. What was going through their minds from the people that you've had a chance to speak to? Are they able to talk about that warfare, what it's like day to day?
Many of them did not talk with their families when they got back. In fact, family members sometimes never knew the extent of their involvement in this campaign, or in fact in any campaign. And trauma perhaps explains part of that, but also a sense that I cannot really explain this to you. I cannot really make you see and understand what it was like for us. They would talk among themselves. They would talk to fellow veterans. And I think one of the things that made it possible for them to do it at all was that bond. In the end, soldiers and sailors and airmen fight for one another as much as for any ideological idea or even a national interest. It's we're in this together, we can do it together, and it would have been very difficult without that sense of community for them to make it across that terrible crossing, which, as was mentioned, took hours on end and Most of the men were terribly seasick, worn out, dehydrated, exhausted, even before the landing craft pitched up onto the beach and that ramp dropped and they ran out into that horrible killing ground. But they did so because the men next to them did it too.
Jacob, let's talk a bit more about the landing site itself. Who chose that landing site and why?
So this was chosen by British and American war planners, and it was chosen because it presented a fairly broad front, and one thing which Montgomery was really concerned about was a bottleneck being formed. So Montgomery said we need a 50-mile front so we can form a beachhead and advance into the country. And Normandy was really somewhat of a surprise of an invasion site because it makes much more sense if you look at a map just to pop across the channel and invade through Calais. But that was seen as a little too predictable. And so that's why they came through Normandy. And the Germans, particularly Adolf Hitler, didn't see Normandy coming up till right when D-Day was happening. He still thought the main attack was going to come through Calais.
Right. And there was also a huge bluff operation, so to speak, that was put into place, put together in part by the BBC. And maybe you'd like to weigh in on that.
Well, can I just jump in on the story of how do you humanize all of this? Because one of the stories that my father told me was in Caen, which was a scene of unimaginable devastation. There were a lot of dogs running around. And so my father was a tank commander, and they took a spaniel puppy that was in the street. And this spaniel puppy survived the whole of the war. He went on and fought in the Battle of Arnhem and on up to Belsen. And actually, he brought this spaniel puppy back with him at the end of the war, and even when he got married, the spaniel lived with them. So I think for a tank, it's obviously the sense of camaraderie, and we're all in it together, and if we're blown up, we'll all die together. But actually, saving a dog was terribly important to them, and I've always found that story very revealing.
Certainly. But
you asked me another question.
Yes, I was asking about, maybe perhaps someone else could weigh in. I was asking about the propaganda operation that was put in place. I understand the BBC put together a sort of photography competition to try and get the best picture of the Normandy coast, which, of course, was just a way of observing where they might be able to move in. Julie?
Yeah, the BBC organised
and
this.
asking lots of people.
Sorry, Anne, let me just hear from Julie first.
Yeah, the BBC organised this thing just to gather information and to be able to prepare the landings better. And also there was all this operation in order to trick the Germans, like this phantom army, which was supposed to get prepared for landings in south of Britain. And all this, the use of secret services to try to mislead the German, and it actually succeeded, as you say.
And apparently it succeeded to the point where one German commander actually went home for the weekend. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. General Rommel, who was in charge of coordinating the defences on the coast, went home for his wife's birthday, which was on D-Day itself. So he was back in Germany when the D-Day invasions happened. And the intelligence operation was called Operation Bodyguard. Hugely successful because it made the Germans think the invasion might come in Norway, so they kept hundreds of thousands of troops there. There was even rumours that there might be more operations in the Balkans and in Greece. And to do that, they actually flew a lookalike of General Montgomery to Algeria to make the Germans think, oh, perhaps Montgomery's there and the action's going to happen in the east. So really successful intelligence operation that went into.
It certainly was, and we're going to talk a lot more about it. We're just going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with part 2 of the France 24 debate. Stay with us. Welcome back to the France 24 debate. This week, the world, of course, marking the 75th anniversary of D-Day, the beginning of the end of World War II. On June 6, 1944, 150,000 British, American, and Canadian troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, a dramatic bid to free France from the Nazis with the biggest combined land, air, and naval operation in history. Well, let's continue our debate now with Craig Simmons, naval historian, speaking to us from Newport, Rhode Island. Craig, just explain to us, if you can, the scale, the scope of just how huge this operation really was.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Let me just follow on for just a second about the reason why Rommel was not there physically watching the beach on D-Day. One of the advantages the Allies had was that they had weather stations up in Ireland and Scotland and could predict the weather 24 hours down the line. When Rommel and his subordinates looked out at the channel on the 5th of June and said, well, only an insane person would try to cross the channel under these conditions. And that was one of the reasons he felt it was safe to head off. Now, the disinformation campaign contributed to that, but he did not have access to the weather reports that the Allies did when Eisenhower made his decision to go. And of course, that decision is hard because the Armada is so big that it cannot all leave port at one moment. We think of Operation Overlord, the naval component of which was called Operation Neptune, as being a single event. But it involved 5 armadas carrying 5 landing forces from 171 different embarkation sites around the British Isles, and they had to leave at different times. So if you were embarking from Scotland, you left on the 3rd of June. You were already well out at sea on the 4th of June when Eisenhower decided, we'll have to postpone this for 24 hours. Then you were at sea again when Eisenhower had to make the final decision, all right, we have a window of opportunity here, let's go. So these thousands of ships all had to converge from around the British Isles on this area south of the Isle of Wight, which is colloquially known as Piccadilly Circus, area zebra, that had been swept by the minesweepers. And it's that point where you get so many survivors who recalled seeing, as far as they could see from horizon to horizon, thousands upon thousands of ships of every possible kind, from battleships down to landing ships and command ships. It was an awesome sight that no one forgot.
Jacob, tell us a bit more about Dwight Eisenhower, the man who led this operation. What was his role? What was it like for him?
Well, he was in charge of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, which was based just outside Portsmouth in Southwark House. And Eisenhower was a supreme organizer of men. So we've talked about the logistical effort. And this was really Eisenhower, one of his great strengths as a commander. And also, you're dealing with a lot of fairly prickly personalities. The British Land Commander Montgomery was not always an easy person to get along with. And some of the other commanders were very strong personalities. And Eisenhower managed to balance all of them, as well as smoking apparently 4 packs of Camels a day, which must have wreaked havoc on the lungs as well.
Let's go now to 40 ans in France, where we're going to bring in Paul Woodage, an author, a D-Day expert, and a battlefield expert. Paul, thank you for joining us. Tell us a bit more about where you are in 40 ans. What's happening there?
I'm right in the middle of 40 ans. That's the church behind me. And it's getting ready for a big event tonight. There's a liberation ball, and there's all reenactors and jeeps and World War II vehicles around. It doesn't look busy behind me, but just a few hundred yards away, it's getting ready for a big event.
And Paul, you have said that World War II has always been a big part of your life. If you had one story to share with us, which you think is the most typical, the most representative of what D-Day means to you, what would that be?
Well, it's always the latest one you've heard. There's no one story. I mean, just 5 minutes before talking to you, I was with a 101st Airborne veteran called George Mullins, who was in the field 100 yards ahead of me. And he was talking about the naval shells coming over his head on June the 12th, as I heard Craig talking about a minute ago. And so that is the story in my head. And his emotion of being here, and he was touching the wall he was crouched beside on D-Day, or on June the 12th, I should say. And so that story now is my favorite. And then the next one tomorrow will be another one.
Have you had a chance to speak to many of the veterans who are there for the big ceremony tomorrow in France?
I did. I was at dinner last night with 16 American World War II veterans, some of who I knew before, some I met for the first time, and just sitting and listening and taking it all in. And I've been here for many anniversaries, and we know that the years are running out where you can sit and listen to the men and the women who are here themselves. It's just amazing.
Thank you for that, Paul. Paul Woodage is speaking to us there from 40 ans. And I've heard that we just now have pictures coming from Portsmouth. There is a boat that's crossing over from Portsmouth over to the beaches of Normandy just at the moment, with some of those veterans on board making that crossing again 75 years after the fact. You can only imagine what must be going through their minds as they're making that symbolic crossing again 75 years after that very first crossing that they made. Craig Simmons, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Paul. Have you spoken to any veterans of World War II who are coming over here, who are in France now for the trip, to talk about their feelings and what's been going through their minds in the past months?
I've not had a chance to talk to any of who are participating in the reenactment that's taking place, I guess, right now. I have, of course, talked to veterans of that experience, and more to the point, have read hundreds, literally hundreds, of oral testimonies that were taken down by tape recorders and then transcribed, and which historians rely heavily on, and which will become all that we have in another decade or so.
No, certainly. And it's true. One thing that is interesting and perhaps the most symbolic about this 75th anniversary is it could be the very last one where we will actually have actual veterans who took part in World War II. Julie, I want to turn back to you. We've been talking a lot about, obviously, many men involved in this, but there were also women. They were few and far between, but there were women who were also involved in D-Day itself. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, the women took a great part in the war, not specifically in the D-Day, but they took a great part in the war effort. Because so many men were mobilized, like government had to use the women resources, and especially in Britain, like there were 640,000 women who served in the army during the war. They served as nurses, they drove ambulances, they served in the transmission services and so on. They were not allowed to carry weapons, which was considered as a privilege for men, as a virile privilege. But they had a great role in helping the men fighting, like that. And they were also very important on the home front. One of the things that was important is the role of women involved in the SOE, who helped communicated with the resistors, and the French women and the French resistance who also contributed to the success of the D-Day.
Yeah, that's something that Anne Sebe, you actually put in your book, Les Parisiennes. You talk a bit about the SOE. Tell us about that.
Reasons why I wanted to write this book, because I felt that the role of women simply hadn't been recognised not only in D-Day, but certainly that was important because Churchill recognised in creating this special operations executive that you had to have women in Paris, because Paris was a city without men at that point, or young men of fighting age. So 39 women were sent to France, and most of them lost their lives, and they had numerous roles. They weren't really spies. They were bolstering the resistance. They were wireless operators. And they really were crucial to telling the French population there's going to be an Allied invasion. We don't quite know when it'll be, but be prepared. They also passed information back to England. And many of these women were originally Parisiennes, and they came to England for training, and then either they were dropped in special drop zones or they parachuted, and they were incredibly brave, and many of them had rudimentary training. There were women who we know about, like Violette Szabo, but there were lots of women who really haven't had their due, and it's about time they did. And there were some women who also laid explosives on railway lines, which was critical in the lead up to D-Day. And as Julie was saying, one of the reasons why they haven't been recognised is because unless they formally joined a resistance group, they probably weren't rewarded or given awards after the war, because awards were given to people who'd been fighting in combat, combattant being a key word, so they needed to wield weapons, and probably women didn't have access to weapons unless they were formally part of a resistance group. Now, some of them did. Some of them were able to leave young children or leave their parents and formally join a resistance group, and maybe they were given their due after the war. But there were so many women who did all sorts of incredible things, like delivering tract or helping evading airmen or hiding resistors on the run or hiding weapons, but they probably weren't rewarded after the war. And being women, perhaps they just wanted to get on with their lives and establish some normalcy, so they didn't fight for recognition. And yet, cumulatively, if you put together what all these women did, yes, certainly the 39 women of SOE French section were absolutely crucial, but there are hundreds of other women who didn't want to talk about this after the war. And now in their 90s, when I found many of them and interviewed them, actually they wanted their grandchildren to know. So it's been a real privilege and honour to talk to some of these women who played a critical part, but not necessarily wearing uniform, because of course that wasn't allowed, and not having been recognised formally by de Gaulle after the war.
And interestingly, the Queen herself, we were mentioning before, took part in the war effort, worked as a mechanic. We have some pictures, we might be able to bring them up, where she's standing next to a vehicle. Of course, this was before she herself became Queen, but that would make her, I believe, the only living monarch who served in the war. And what do you think that that represents for her for these 75th anniversary celebrations?
I think it's absolutely incredible. But what you've hit upon is one of the key aspects, that English and American women, of course, could join the Wrens, the WAFs, or the ATC, or all sorts of the Girls' Training Corps. There were all sorts of ways that British and American women could wear uniforms, so they knew they were fighting the enemy, and other people could see they were fighting the enemy. But of course, French women, unless a handful of them joined de Gaulle and the Free French in London, but that really was a handful, most French women couldn't wear uniform, and so they went about in an undercover way doing what they did. And as I say, I think if you look at all their actions, you'll see that they did much more than they've been recognised for. But yes, of course, the Queen is an extraordinary figurehead to have on this occasion. Amazing.
I'd like to talk a bit more about just after D-Day, what happened over the next days and weeks. Jacob, if you'd like to weigh in on that.
Well, yeah, D-Day was just the start of the effort, so you have to carry on pushing troops into Normandy so you can take control of the area and then push into Germany. So one of the things which was really important was something called the Mulberry, which was a very big artificial harbour. They tried to set up two. One was destroyed in the gale, but the other one, which was named Port Winston Churchill, survived for 10 months and 2.5 million men were landed there. So really after Normandy, you have to then move across, then capture cities like Cannes and Cherbourg, and make sure that you don't get thrown back into the Atlantic.
Craig Simmons, what did the French think of the Americans just after D-Day? I mean, we do hear a lot of these happier stories about GIs handing out candy, but there are also quite a few darker stories as well.
There are. I think it's interesting that time changes our views sometimes, but I think in large part, the French were thrilled that the yoke of German occupation looked like it would at last be lifted from France, and perceived the Americans in particular as their liberators. Always a little bit of tension between the British and the French, but the Americans and the Canadians in particular were welcomed, vive les Américains, as they came ashore, and were greeted with Calvados, which left some of the GIs rather tipsy after imbibing that particularly strong apple brandy of the region. So I think on the whole, it was very positive. There were some elements of uncertainty. Eisenhower had to make a very difficult decision about what was called the bombing strategy of the transportation network. His concern was to interrupt that transportation network by hitting the rail yards so that the Germans could not move reinforcement troops down to the beach once they realized that Normandy was indeed the target. But knowing that a transportation bombing strategy would cause significant civilian casualties in France, he struggled very hard with that. He and General Lee Mallory, who commanded the air arm, argued vociferously about this, about what would be the best use of Allied air. And in the end, Eisenhower won the argument. They did bomb the rail yards. It did keep the Germans away, but it also cost a number of French lives. My suspicion is that the French, by and large, were willing to pay that sacrifice for final victory.
Let's go back to Paul Woodage, who is in Carentan, France at the moment. Paul, if you're still with us, tell us a bit more about your own personal stories and how your interest in World War II began.
Very simply, my great-uncle landed on Sword Beach with the 2nd Battalion of Royal Ulster Rifles. So I was coming here when I was 14, 15 years old, 35 years ago. It got under my skin. I've been here 20 years now, and you can never know too much. There's always things to learn. There's always stories to find out about it. It's an obsession, really.
And what's it like walking on the beaches today?
Well, I mean, this week you've got everything going on, but generally it's what surprises people is the beaches are actually living and breathing. And the beaches are not memorials, the cemeteries are the memorials. And so in the summer, people bathe and swim and sunbathe, and that can confuse visitors. But you ask any of the locals here, they say, well, that's what it was for. The liberation was to give us back the beaches so we can go and swim. So there's the mix of you can understand the significance of the history, but also it looks like any kind of pleasure beach in the world in some ways. So it's the two worlds go on in the same place.
And being there, just as you're speaking, we were seeing some images of French President Emmanuel Macron, who was just there earlier, paying tribute to those victims of the French resistance who were killed also on D-Day, June 6, 1944 in Caen. Talk to us a bit, if you will, Paul, about the importance of the resistance and if it's still very present in people's minds there today.
Well, the thing about Normandy is the resistance here wasn't the resistance that we think of from the films of particularly going up and blowing up trains. The resistance here was about gathering information. The resistance was much more active in that sort of destructive way in other parts of France, Limoges and around Paris and the forested areas. Here, it's about gathering the information that the Allied forces used when they came here, so the maps and the information. So many French Normand people wouldn't have been aware really of the resistance going on because we didn't encourage an active resistance in that sense. So it's very, very important, but it was very discreet here.
Thank you again for that, Paul Woodage speaking to us there from Carentan. Craig, I just want to ask you a bit about General Charles de Gaulle, seen here as such a hero in France, but who actually had a bit of a prickly relationship, particularly with Winston Churchill, with the U.S. Tell us about that.
There are a number of individuals with prickly personalities involved in this campaign, as was mentioned earlier, Montgomery being one of them, Patton another. Charles de Gaulle, I think, felt a deep personal sense of humiliation at the French defeat in 1940, and because of that carried a large chip on his shoulder. Any perception of dismissiveness by his fellow allies, he took quite personally, and he went out of his way to make sure that the French, and that he in particular, were treated as equal partners in this enterprise. And because there was a difficult relationship, especially with Churchill, he was kept out of the loop. He was not informed during the planning or even until the very eve of the invasion that this was going to take place. And he took terrible offense at that. You were invading my country, a government that I represent. You didn't even tell me what was going on. He found that absolutely outrageous. Part of that he brought upon himself by his defensive personality, but part of it too was simply distrust on the part of particularly Winston Churchill, but the Anglo-American allies generally, that would it be wise to share all this information with him? Would everyone in the Free French organization be able to keep that secret? It was a closely held secret anyway, but that's a question that historians have revisited more than once.
And it's interesting because apparently Charles de Gaulle took it so personally that France didn't actually celebrate D-Day for decades. It was only recently, I believe under François Mitterrand, that France began commemorating the ceremony. Julie, tell us about that.
In 1964, de Gaulle refused to commemorate the D-Day anniversary, and he chose to commemorate the liberation of Provence on the 15th of August instead. And he wanted, by doing that, to emphasize the fact, or his view, that France was liberated by itself and that the French troops who took part in the Dragon operation in Provence contributed to the liberation of Paris, which is obviously partly a myth. I mean, they contributed, the operation in Provence was very important, but the main operation was the Overlord operation.
We just have a minute left. And let me just turn to you. We were talking earlier about how important it is to remember the sacrifice of all of these men, so many people who died on June 6, 1944. What will the secret be to keeping their memory, their legacy alive?
Talking about it, education, and I think the present generation in France and certainly in England is absolutely fascinated still. I don't think there's any danger, just because it'll be desperately sad when there aren't still people alive who lived through it, but I don't see interest in this dying anytime soon.
And Seba, thank you so much for speaking to us. You're an author of Les Parisiennes. Thank you for the rest of my guests as well. Craig Simmons in Newport, Rhode Island. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us, sir. Thanks as well to you, Julie Legac and Jacob Field. Thank you for being here for the whole 2 hours with us as well. That wraps up this France 24 debate. See you on the other side. All right, we are back with Emerald Maxwell from Media Watch. And a lot of focus on D-Day today.
Yeah, I've been looking at some of the coverage online. I'm going to start with the Washington Post, which called it a stirring commemoration to mark the 75th anniversary of D-Day. Macron was one of a number of world leaders in Portsmouth taking part in the commemorations. He read aloud from a letter from a 16-year-old French resistance fighter who was executed. He read aloud from that letter. And a lot of people online were saying it was actually one of the high points. Here we have Vince Cable, who's a British politician, saying that it was a high point for him of the commemorations. Macron has really been trying to he's trying to draw a tie between the spirit of the resistance and the art of being French, as Le Figaro points out here. Tomorrow he'll continue to take part in commemorations in Normandy. And the Figaro says that he's trying to, these words, l'art d'être français, the art of being French, are words that he used in a previous speech straight after the Notre Dame fire, when he was talking to the Yellow Vest to try and unify people. He's using it again now. As he won't be alone tomorrow, he's obviously going to be accompanied by Donald Trump, who it's his third visit to France. And HuffPost did a poll showing how, in fact, his opinions of him in France have really been polarized over the last few years. So we have l'image de Trump en France. Since 2016, his impressions of him in France people have a more positive, but also equally a more negative. Here you see the number of positive impressions of him has gone up to nearly 20%, and meanwhile negative has also gone up to 70% just in the last couple of years. And so one person who didn't get the invite, though, is of course Russian President Vladimir Putin. Sputnik, it's the Russian publication, points out here. And this actually has polarized a lot of people criticizing this decision. Here we have Le Figaro, which is a center-right publication. But they also did a poll basically asking people if they thought he should have been invited to D-Day and to the commemorations, and 80% said he should have been, and criticizing the decision. His basically him being So here we have people on Twitter pointing out the irony that Russia paid almost the entire butcher bill for World War II. And yet he wasn't invited to this Broadway play for the Queen, referring to the commemorations in Portsmouth today. He posted this article on The Independent, reminding us how the Soviet Union saved the world from Hitler. Another Twitter user also here pointing out the irony that Angela Merkel, whose country welcomed the troops out of Portsmouth with tons of gunfire in Normandy, was invited, but Putin, whose country decisively turned the tide of the war and made D-Day possible in the first place, isn't.
Now, things aren't quite as rosy as they might seem, despite the fact that many people are happy. The world leaders are all turning up tomorrow to be for the celebration. But tell us a bit more about the animosity angle. Yeah, exactly. So there is some irony in the fact that all these world leaders are saluting the joint international effort of D-Day, when at a time when, as the NBC points out, the post-war order is under threat. And it's not, this article mentions, it's not just ties with Russia, but also between the US and Europe, its European allies. They've become strained under Trump because he has attacked both the UN and NATO. And here we have MEP Guy Verhofstadt. Basically, it's a subtle dig because the Queen Elizabeth, at a dinner with Trump, defended internationalism and post-World War institutions, which was just a subtle dig at President Trump.
And here we have this MEP saluting her for doing so. And I'd like to end on some political cartoons. There's a few cartoonists have pointed out that they've made the same joke, that Trump probably thinks the D in D-Day is for Donald. And here we have, in the New Yorker, Cooper. If I scroll down a bit, we can see I can't seem to scroll down, but basically just trying to remind Trump that the D isn't for Donald, it's for something much bigger than that. And it's another sort of subtle dig at Donald Trump.
Emerald, thank you for that. Emerald Maxwell there with that look at the Media Watch. Thanks again to you, and thanks to all of you for watching France 24. Do stay with us. Laura Sellier is up next with more live coverage of D-Day commemorations.